So we have some passages from Jubilees that continue to be cited or used in Greek chronicles of or histories, and in certain other places we find these information from Jubilees shows up, but that's more kind of the reception history of certain passages of Jubilees. But the book itself just is it basically disappears from the scene and is only rediscovered in the in the I guess post Reformation time and post Enlightenment Europe, where they are looking back at these citations and these passages and say there must have been this book, and we know about it because some of the Greek fathers mention a name of leptogenesis or little Genesis, which is the Greek name, or the Book of Jubilees, and so they know it exists. And then in the 1850s, a missionary actually from Ethiopia brought back a copy of this book of Jubilees to Germany, and then it was kind of reintroduced to the West into scholarship as this book, and then it proved that it matched up with the citations that were known from antiquity, from these Greek sources and stuff. And so then people could accept that this was actually the book. So in a sense, Jubilees was a book only known by title for a while as well.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Matthew Monger, and just up front, this is about an article from the Journal of Biblical Literature, but it is one of two so far that have really surprised me because they were not at all what I expected. So this will be the first one that you're hearing. As of this recording, I sat down and recorded the other interview today, but it's about text criticism, which is something that's come up before. It's about how the differences from one copy of a text to another end up kind of being all brought together, incorporated, or set aside from different texts. But it's not actually a biblical text that we're discussing. It's a papal decree that lists biblical texts. So it is related to biblical studies. It is related to engagement with biblical texts. And the conversation does go broad enough that it's certainly not outside of the subject matter that this podcast looks to cover. But it is interesting and it caught me off guard. So this was really fun. Make sure you check out The Bible Was Written Backwards, which is Matthew Monger's YouTube channel. Of course, as always, if you have any guest suggestions or feedback for me, or you just want to have a friendly correspondence with me, hit me up at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. Here's my conversation with Matthew Monger. Matthew Monger, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm associate professor of Near Eastern languages and literatures in Oslo, Norway, and basically I teach ancient Near Eastern languages, so Akkadian, Sumerian, Syriac, different things like that. But I'm trained in Semitic languages and linguistics, and also work with manuscript studies. And so I did my dissertation on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I have worked with manuscript traditions in a variety of different languages and cultures.
Somehow that feels understated because, like we were saying just now before we started recording, I was kind of thrown for a loop by. So we're going to be discussing your Journal of Biblical Literature article, "The Book of the Daughters of Adam in the Galatian Decree." Did I pronounce that correctly?
I mean, yeah, I usually say Galatian, but that's probably just lazy
Uh,
pronunciation. I'm not actually sure what the right way is. So
no,
Galatian or
no,
Galatian or
you're
whatever, we're
so
good to go.
Galatian.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm putting on airs. So for the listeners, this should just be two Virginia boys. So I won't.
Yeah.
I won't put on
We don't
airs.
have to pretend. Yeah.
Yeah, we're just folks. So okay, my first question will be, like, can you explain what the Galatian decree is. But I just want to kind of comment on, I was surprised that this is a layer of biblical studies. And it seems like it's like trying to identify, is this document that's not a biblical text but is describing biblical texts, is it talking about something we know about, or is this something we don't know about? And then there's a lot of layers there. So that's my setup for the question for the listeners' benefit. But so do you mind taking a moment to explain what the Galatian decree is?
Yeah. So the Galatian decree is basically let's start with what a decree is kind of a technical term in the Catholic Church. So it's something that a pope has officially decreed or said. And so the Galatian decree is the decree that is in said to have been given by Pope Gelasius the first, who was Pope like in 392 to 396 or something like that. So it's a Pope from 1600 years ago, and it is one of the first official lists of books that are included in the canon of Scripture, and also lists books that are acceptable for a good Catholic to read, and then unacceptable. And so we kind of have three layers found in this decree that kind of lists the books that are currently found in the Roman Catholic canon, so the Vulgate canon, which has both the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the deuterocanonical books, or the Apocrypha, that are all considered canonical. And then you have this list of like church fathers and other I guess you could call it upworthy or useful books that could be read. And then we have this apocryphal section that says things you absolutely shouldn't be reading. And so this is something that was collected probably over the period of a few hundred years, but the list itself is pretty important because it's copied again and again and again, because it goes back to the time, at least put to the 3, 4, 500s, and shows us which books were actually being read in the church.
So you think that origin of around 390 or something, you think that's legitimate?
I mean, honestly, we don't know, and I think that probably there's a layer that goes back to one of the councils. So these kind of texts often come out of the ecumenical councils, the early church councils, and so probably there is a layer of something that goes back that far, to a council in the, maybe say, 300s, but it's the final form, what we as we have it now, I think, is probably a result of a little bit later. So we're probably into the 400s, into the 400s, when this is formulated as we have it with all these lists of books.
Okay, and so this decree mentions the book of the daughters of Adam.
Yeah.
So what is that?
Well, that's why I wrote this article. That's what I wanted to get into. So this article actually came out of a project that I was doing at the Norwegian Academy of Sciences, that two colleagues of mine put together, which was called Books Known Only by Title. And so they were studying the phenomenon of books being mentioned in other texts, but not actually existing in reality, or we having no trace of them. And sometimes that is a product of just kind of literary fantasy, right? So things that you would find in one type, in certain types of literature, would just be books that are thrown out there. And we find that a similar sort of thing in the Bible, even, that we have these kind of books that are mentioned that we don't actually know whether they existed. Like in the book of Kings or in the book of Chronicles, it might mention the books of the annals of the kings of Judah and stuff like that. We don't know if they exist because we don't have them, but they might exist. But and so this, what we were doing was looking for examples of this from the different fields that we work in. And because I have studied the book of Jubilees quite a bit, this was something that I had run across in my studies of the book of Jubilees, because this particular entry, the Book of the Daughters of Adam, is also called the Book of the Daughters of Adam of leptogenesis, which is the Greek name for the Book of Jubilees. And the Book of Jubilees is a text then that is found in, let's say, the Ethiopic canon, but in basically no other Bibles that are out there. And so this is, again, like you asked in the beginning, like we're kind of far from traditional biblical studies already when we do that. But when we look in the Galatian decree and we see the word leptogenesis, automatically scholars today will say, "Oh, that's the Book of Jubilees." And then there's this thing where it says it's the Book of the Daughters of Adam. And that's really interesting because we have literally no evidence from anywhere else in antiquity or the Middle Ages of a text that's titled the Book of the Daughters of Adam. And so it's kind of an anomaly. It's something that doesn't exist. But at the same time, scholars today, when they write about this thing, seem to be very confident that it's just the Book of Jubilees is what we're talking about, or just an extract of the names of the women that are in the Book of Jubilees, but not found in the Book of Genesis. And so I got interested in trying to see what do we actually know when we look at the manuscripts of the Galatian decree. What's there? How do we get to this entry in a modern edition of the text that calls it the Book of the Daughters of Adam of leptogenesis? How did we get to that point?
So I think because Jubilees it's, I mean, it's going to be obscure for pretty much everybody because, like you said, it was in Ethiopic canon, but not in extant copies of other Bibles. But it was known to have been considered a part of the canon, right? Is that
Well, it depends. I mean, so no, I would not say it was considered to be part of the canon, like in those terms, because I think it was probably something that was in use and circulation before we really had an established canon in either the Jewish or Christian faiths. And so we have a lot of manuscripts with texts from Jubilees among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and actually quite a large number. So probably somewhere around 15, 16, 17 manuscripts with Jubilees, and that's as much as we have of almost any book of the Hebrew Bible. And so somebody might say that it would then be considered canonical among the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we have no canon really in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it was important, and it might even have been authoritative, like considered useful and all that. And in the early Christian church, it was also considered a very useful book. So it was used. It was used by some of the early church fathers when they would argue against heresies. They would cite from the Book of Jubilees, and then when early Christian writers were writing histories of the world, they also used the Book of Jubilees to fill in gaps in Genesis, because Jubilees has information that you just can't find in the Book of Genesis.
so? How does it? I mean, because it does kind of go missing, right?
Well, yeah, and at some point, Jubilees is no longer considered acceptable in the main churches in Christianity. It finds its way to Ethiopia, where it does continue to be important, but as a text in both the main Eastern and Western churches, so the Eastern Orthodox and Syriac churches, and in the West. It's lost by the time we get to the Middle Ages.
So pretty much continuous presence in the Ethiopic church, but it fades away in other larger Western or like Orthodox traditions. That's
Yeah,
what you're saying.
and as manuscripts, so we have some passages from Jubilees that continue to be cited or used in Greek chronicles of or histories, and in certain other places. We find these information from Jubilees shows up, but that's more kind of the reception history of certain passages of Jubilees. But the book itself just is it basically disappears from the scene and is only rediscovered in the in the I guess post Reformation time and post Enlightenment Europe, where they are looking back at these citations and these passages and say there must have been this book, and we know about it because some of the Greek fathers mention a name of leptogenesis or little Genesis, which is the Greek name, or the Book of Jubilees, and so they know it exists. And then in the 1850s, a missionary actually from Ethiopia brought back a copy of this Book of Jubilees to Germany, and then it was kind of reintroduced to the West and to scholarship as this book, and then it proved that it matched up with the citations that were known from antiquity, from these Greek sources and stuff, and so then people could accept that this was actually the book. So in a sense, Jubilees was a book only known by title for a while as well.
But now, so how many titles was it known by? Because
Mm.
that's relevant to the topic in the
Yeah.
article, right?
Yeah. So the main title for Jubilees in antiquity seems to have been leptogenesis, which is basically it's Greek. Genesis it means beginning or origin, and is the name of the first book of the Bible in Greek, and lepto means little or details or something like that. And so actually scholars don't agree 100% whether we're talking about little Genesis or the details of Genesis or something like that. But the name leptogenesis was widely used. We see this in Latin, sometimes called parve Genesis, which means little Genesis. So it's again, it's a translation of that. And in Hebrew, we have a couple of names. It probably was called the Book of the Divisions in Hebrew, which is how it begins. It begins by saying, "This is the Book of the Divisions of the Times," and so that's generally the way you name text in Hebrew, is just taking the first line of the text. But it's also called in a couple of places the Book of Jubilees, and that's because it structures history according to the years of Jubilees. So every 49 years in the Hebrew calendar, at least in the Old Testament, it mentions this 49-year cycle of the years of Jubilees, and so that it restructures all of history into the numbers of Jubilees from creation. So that's but beyond that, sometimes the title can be confused with other ancient works. So it can be called the Apocalypse of Moses. It can be called, sometimes texts from Jubilees are cited as being from Josephus. So it seems to have been that the text itself was better known than the titles for it.
So, and I asked that just to, I think, to bridge for listeners the idea that it's not just a wild guess. It's not outside of the realm of possibility that a book that is popularly known as one thing could have another name. And so seeing this reference in the decree, um, and so on the decree, just kind of switching gears. So you reference a critical edition of it. And
Yes.
th- so this is, I think, particularly why I think this is why this is so interesting to me. It is biblical studies, obviously, but it's also a lot of the critical, I don't know, philology, things like that, involved in biblical studies that are often shrouded by, unfortunately or fortunately, I guess, depending on your perspective, the significance that is placed on the Bible, biblical texts, however you want to frame that.
Yeah.
But that's not true of the decree. The decree is
Right.
just, it's an important document, it's an historical document, and so it's studied like any other historical document. And how is that vis-a-vis a critical edition?
Yeah. So that's a really interesting point, and that's so what I mean. So a critical edition is basically just a scholarly publication that tries to figure out or tries to show what different examples or witnesses to a given text we have. And when we talk about this, we talk about modern critical editions. The goal of them is to help a reader not have to go find manuscripts, but to be able to know what witnesses, what evidence there is for the actual words on the page of a given text. And that is because in in general, manuscripts are never identical. So whether we're talking about biblical manuscripts or Homer or literature, or any other work, the manuscripts we have are going to be different in some ways. Whether it's just tiny little details or large things, they're always going to be different. And a critical edition just helps you navigate the most important differences between the manuscripts that we have. And so when a scholar goes to look at the critical edition, they're going to want to know, first of all, what's been kind of reconstructed as the best text, the most likely text that was originally written. That's kind of what you first think you're looking for. But the way I work is just a little bit different than that, because I'm more interested in variance than I am in actual reconstructions or whatever. I'd rather see what was written in different places, because it shows that there is variation, that people are reading things differently and seeing things differently, and that's where relying on a critical edition is really helpful, because in this case, Ernst von Dobschütz has collected evidence from I think like 50, 60, well, I guess there's like 100, almost 100 different manuscripts that he's collected, and gives you the most important variants from those. And so I can look at that, and I mean, there's a lot of like symbols, and you have to kind of learn the shorthand for doing it, but then you can see what any individual manuscript actually has written for this passage in question. And then you can start to see, like, especially for this example, that there were a ton of different variants, a ton of different texts in the individual manuscripts, which then says to me that there is something going on. So when we have a text that has a lot of different variants, you have to wonder, why were they not copying it the same every single time?
So you think there's a conspiracy?
Yeah, that's where I always go, straight to conspiracy. No, no. So that, and that's I don't think I use the word conspiracy at all in my article, so I try
No,
try to
no,
avoid
no.
that.
That's me. That's me.
Okay.
That's me. Just trying to have fun.
Yeah.
So
But
please
it might be.
don't put that on him. No, let's go as far away from that. This is. I did this. I stepped in it. Well, go on.
Yeah. No, so but yeah, I mean my and I guess my whole point is that when we see things like that, and you might think, man, what are they trying to do? Like, is it a conspiracy? What are they trying to suppress? What are they doing? The we have to ask the question, like, honestly, of the material that's in front of us, how do these things happen? And so my question going in was first to find out what level of variance there is between the different manuscripts. But then when you get down to it, you start asking the question, did the scribes actually know what they were copying? and and that's kind of the direction I ended up going in the article, was developing the idea that it actually seems like this text, which we have no evidence of a title for in antiquity or the Middle Ages, might not have been known to the scribes that were copying it, which would definitely be a more likely cause of variance than, in my opinion, them trying to cover up or change something that they did know about.
I want to go back. It was kind of a minor thing that you said, but levels of variance. Is
Mhm.
that quantitative? Is that qualitative? Is that some other category that I don't know anything about? How would you characterize that?
I would say, well, both. I mean, so we have quantitative variance in that some things are just um, we have a lot of numbers of variants for a single word. And so that would be like for the word leptogenesis, which is the title of Jubilees in Greek. It gets used in this Latin manuscript, and then it's all over the place. We have so many different ways in which scribes have tried to write this, And I think the word was originally leptogenesis. So I think that that's what was in the manuscript originally that was copied. But scribes, if they didn't know the Greek word that they were copying, or the Greek part of the word they were copying, because it's those two things. Genesis is actually also used in Latin, so they would have known Genesis, but they wouldn't have known the lepto part necessarily. And so if they're looking for a Latin word and trying to make sense of it, then all kinds of crazy things happen. So we get lipto and lecto and lapto and lacto and all these Latin words that are Latin words that make sense, but don't make sense in relation to the Bible or Genesis, but that are good Latin words. And so I think that that's like a good, like, there's a lot of just a ton of different things there. But at the same time, we do see some interesting variants appear that are, in my opinion, qualitatively interesting. So we do know from the Middle Ages of a book called, or from antiquity even already, a book called the Book of Adam. And so when some scribes chose to say the Book of Adam in this place instead of saying the Book of the Daughters of Adam, I think that's an interesting thing from a historical perspective, that a scribe would say, "Oh, I know about that. That makes sense to me." So I could call it the Book of Adam, and that would be a type of variant that we can understand and discuss in a different way than we can the variants of just getting the lepto wrong.
So you have 50 or 100 different manuscripts of the same text, and
Mhm.
you as a text critic, you're evaluating those different things. Uh, I know, like a layman, I would be like, well, what's the oldest one? Right, and that may not necessarily be right. But or
Right.
there's the most consistent one. Is there ever an instance where maybe the methodological weight would go toward this document, and it is statistically, it seems more accurate or more reliable than the other documents, but it's wrong, or the assessment is that it is wrong in this spot, but not in the entirety.
Right. And that's a really interesting question, because so I've studied this the Galatian decree very, very narrowly. I'm only looking at this one single entry. And so the observations I make on that can't be extrapolated to have meaning for the rest of the document. So that's an interesting thing. Like, that I can't necessarily say whether the other readings in the Galatian decree are better in these manuscripts where they have this than in anything else. So that's like, we have to take everything on an individual basis when we work at this level. But you asked about like a few different things, right? So one thing is the age. Um, so
Yeah, sorry, I do that.
yeah, yeah, well, we'll work through it. But so in my in the article, I do in a way account for the age question, because I mean, I think it's intuitive for us to think the oldest is going to have some value, at least, or some more value. But theoretically, within textual criticism, we tend to say that that's a fallacy, to think that just because something's old, that it's more valuable as a witness, because you might have later copies of something that were copied from an earlier and better source, but we just have generations or time between when they're actually copied. But at the same time, there is a point that if we can trace something earlier than anything else, then it must have been in circulation before those other things. And so I account for that in the article by using only the manuscripts that were copied in the 10th century or earlier. And so basically that cuts the number of manuscripts in half, but at the same time that includes basically all the types of variants that we find in the manuscripts as a whole. So I don't lose anything by only going for the I would think it's like 46 earliest manuscripts instead of looking at all of them or writing about all of them. I've checked them, but when just you end up getting a lot of numbers and city names and things like that when you try to write about everything. But so age is interesting, and that because it shows me that we're closer in time to a collected manuscript tradition. But at the same time, when we talk about general like textual criticism, we usually have two principles that can be competing that scholars like to talk about. And one is the like that the shorter reading is the best, is this common thing in textual criticism. So you would think that a scribe would be more likely to expand on something than to reduce it to a to something that is just as meaningful. So if you have a phrase and it makes sense, and then you have another expanded phrase that also makes sense, you would think the shorter one is more likely the original. And but on the other hand, we have a principle that the more difficult reading is stronger. And so if you're looking at something and it's hard to make sense of in one manuscript, but it's kind of well written and understandable in another. If you have no other explanation for the change, probably the more difficult reading was the original, and somebody later came and tried to fix it to make it more understandable for the reader. Um, those aren't fixed in stone, so I don't like to use those principles as as anything other than kind of guidelines to get you started, because I think that the best explanation for anything is always the one that weighs all the evidence and makes the most sense altogether. It's and in our case, I think the shorter reading, so dropping maybe the say it says the book of the daughters of Adam, and if we drop the daughters and say the book of Adam, I think that's not necessarily a better reading, because it probably is more familiar of a title to an medieval scribe, and so they would be more likely to choose that reading based on other things than that they're trying to fix the text or whatever. So it seems less likely that you would add the daughters of to a text than you would remove it. But I could be wrong. And this is the problem with these kind of text critical things. It comes down to our personal evaluation of them.
That is, yeah, that is interesting. That so comparing you and the scribe or scribes who are responsible for that particular change, your motivation as a text critic is one thing. I'm trying to get the idea or you're trying to get as close to the idea that was originally being transmitted in this text, and they're trying to get to. Well, hold on, to back up. I suppose you're trying to get to a correct assessment of the origin of this text, and they're trying to get to the correct assessment of the origin of this text, and you're doing different things to get at that. And I think a question I've had about text critics for a while is, do you ever attribute bad faith to a
Mm.
scribe? And this can be you, or this can be
Yeah,
like in the macro,
yeah, yeah,
the plural, do you?
yeah. So yes. So me personally, I attribute bad faith to scribes all the time. That sounds wrong, but so I'm the kind of text critic who actually I don't care that much about the origin. I'm more interested in what was being copied, read, used in a specific context at a specific time. And so I'm more interested in the fact that scribes give so many different renderings of this text than the question of what originally was there. And in my article, I don't even answer the question of what was originally there. I just kind of say, it's probably fine like that. But the real interesting thing is that nobody seems to be trying even to make it into the original thing, the correct thing. And there's such a difference there that I think some scribes were probably in good faith trying to fix it, and I think in our case, I don't think there was actually any maliciousness to it. But in other cases, I would say that there are definitely examples of scribes that want to fix the theology of something, that want to fix the presentation of something, and that has varying degrees of, I guess, of goodness to it. Like there's some that definitely are very pious in their intentions, and I think there are others that definitely, some scribes that would change things in order to make a text less appealing. And so we have this. We have examples of this in scribes that have copied discussions from, or debates or letters from church fathers that they don't agree with, or from other theological issues that will either annotate them or make their impose their opinions on it. And so I think there's definitely the case that scribes do intervene into the text.
Okay, so because I'm here to learn, I want to make sure I understand. You're saying your interest is not so much in the origin. I mean, you did literally say that, but I think to put it in my words, so I know I got it, is in a period or maybe even a place, you're looking at what is circulating.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, and what do you? So for this, we'll say, what do you find that you can come to understand about the text, or about the people generating the text, or about the people who were respecting this particular text? What do you think you're deriving from that?
Yeah. So I mean, my main conclusion for this part of my article and this part of my research is just that I don't think that scribes knew what the Book of Jubilees or this leptogenesis was, and I don't think that they necessarily understood if there was any connection at all, or a title to a book called the Book of the Daughters of Adam. And so my main observation is just that I think that we have here a climate of copying this text. It was a decree, part of the church canons, that you're supposed to, document and copy and keep going. But they didn't know what this thing was, what this actual title referred to. And I find that very interesting because it's something they're supposed to avoid, right? It's on the list of books you're not allowed to read, not allowed to do anything with. And then I don't think they knew what it was. And so that says something to me about the socio-historical situation of these scribes, that we like. I think sometimes we think scribes were pre-modern encyclopedias, that they would have known, have access to all these texts, and would have been part of this textual culture. And sometimes we like maybe think that they knew about more things than they actually knew about. Like, I'm not saying that they weren't smart or well read or anything like that, but I think, like, just the fact that we know about a text doesn't mean that they were widely known in antiquity or in the Middle Ages. And so my basic uh, finding or a thought on this is just that we can expect that scribes sometimes had no idea what they were copying, and that this gives us a really good example of that. That even though they may be able to make sense of most of the words, it's actually not something that was part of the the literary universe that they were aware of. And so as someone interested in the Book of Jubilees, it actually changes a little bit the way we think about jubilees, because instead of this kind of mantra that we have, that, well, scribes knew about it because they copied this, and we have these citations that are found in that text and in that text, that it kind of lives on through its reception in these individual pieces. I think it was actually quite forgotten. And then it's the fact that we as modern scholars can connect the dots between these different things, makes us say, oh, well, that's what it must be. That's what it's referring to. And so it's kind of, yeah, I think that actually it shows us that scribes didn't know about it.
So the idea that maybe, because you said 10th century or earlier,
Mhm.
so a document that possibly began to be circulated in the fourth century, fourth, fifth
Mm.
century. So a scribe copying it in the seventh century, who maybe doesn't, who knows of jubilees, but is copying this text for someone who wants it over there.
Mm.
and doesn't know anything about that, and they have to deal with the title of a book that they're not familiar with
Right.
necessarily, that is not directly named as this thing that we're talking about. There's no reason for them to associate the title that we're discussing here, the Book of the Daughters of Adam,
Mhm.
with Jubilees or
Right.
leptogenesis or whatever.
Yeah. Well, they might not even know about jubilees. I think is what is my point. I mean, some of the scribes probably had never heard of jubilees or leptogenesis or parvegenesis or any of it, and so I think that's what led to some of the confusion is that jubilees just wasn't there in circulation between the fifth and 10th centuries and or through the through the 15th century, I guess. Like we don't have manuscript evidence for it. So there's a Latin palimpsest that was it's a copy of a text that was erased sometime in I guess in the fifth century, and then something else was written over it, and that's like the only Latin text we know of for jubilees. And after that, we see the mention in this in the Galatian decree that it's not trustworthy, and then maybe it's not something that's in people's vocabulary at all, and so they wouldn't even have you don't have anything to hang that information on. It's just you're just reading a line, you're trying to copy the letters and the words as best you can, and that's it.
Okay. I this is this is kind of silly, but a few years ago, at work we were all in an auditorium, and the person at the front of the room made a reference to Peanuts, Charlie Brown, like the wah wah
Hmm.
wah, and the person sitting next to me, everybody, most people laughed, and the person sitting next to me said, "I was born in '95," um, which is not a long time ago. Uh,
No.
and yet he's like, yeah, this reference doesn't, this doesn't land with me. Even though that was not even 30 years ago at that time. And
Right.
so, yeah, the idea that this thing is in a world where, information is harder to access,
Yeah.
you kind of, yeah, I think what you're saying is cut people some slack, that even
Yeah.
if they were top tier intellectuals, the best, the most well read people in their world in their time, that doesn't mean they knew everything. So, yeah, that's fair.
Right.
I want to make sure I get to a couple of terms that are in your
Uh-huh.
article.
Yep.
Uh, and so the first one, and I put in the question. While I understand that you don't you do not enter into a discussion of genealogical relationships among manuscripts, I would like you to explain that term to me. And then the other
Yep.
one, just in case you want to flow right into it afterward, is calc. I don't know if I'm saying
Yep.
that correctly.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
I'll
Yeah.
mute my
So
mic now.
okay, yeah. So genealogical relationships between manuscripts. Basically, textual critics like to use biology as a metaphor for manuscripts and talk about manuscript families and family trees and stemmas and stematas. So like the way a mother and a father give birth to a child, a manuscript, and whatever. And so we talk about families of manuscripts as being ones that are copied from a common source. And so when we talk about genealogical relationships, basically what we mean is as these different families of manuscripts that probably belong together because they have a common line of copying, line of descent from an older manuscript. And I mean, I don't get into that in the article because I'm not that interested in it, but at the same time it does kind of it is part of it because the variants or the types of variants that we find in manuscripts often kind of clump together in manuscript families. And so that would be one way of like when you go and look at a text, you're trying to make families or see how things are related. You would say like for the Galatian decree as a whole, there's actually 5 chapters to it, and some of the manuscripts only have the first 2 chapters, and some only have the last 3, and then some have all of them. And so those would be kind of often seen as clearly um, family families of manuscripts because if you're copying only those 2 things, then it seems likely that you were copying from a source that only had those and stuff like that. but then it also the variants themselves might help you sort into families. So say if all the manuscripts that have drop the book of the daughters, but just have the book of Adam, would belong in probably in a genealogical family, that they descend from a common archetype or a common grandfather manuscript or whatever that had that change. And then that's why we don't count necessarily numbers of manuscripts with a given variant, but rather look at how how um, how those variants might have arisen. So if you might find 70 manuscripts with a given variant, but if they all were copied from the same parent manuscript that then is kind of the same age and value of other manuscripts, then you wouldn't say those 70 count more than those few others. So it's kind of a yeah, it's just one of those problems of textual criticism, that we have to always go back and forth between age and numbers and quality and all that. And so then the other term, the calque, is basically, it's a technical term for the way a word enters a another language when it's translated or brought in. And so you got me thinking when you asked that question. I saw you sent a note beforehand about that, and so I should have. I actually am not precise enough in that term in the article. So what I'm talking about is leptogenesis being used in Latin. And what we have with the word leptogenesis is actually a partial calque, because Genesis is translated directly as Genesis, which is fine. And so it's not like Genesis is known in Latin. We know what it means. It means the same thing as it means in Greek, but it's the name of the book of Genesis. So it's a Latin reader does not need to think about it as anything other than a word that means something. But the word lepto is taken directly from Greek. And so there's what happens when we do that is that we end up with this kind of partial hybrid word that does not have meaning by itself in Latin. Genesis does, lepto doesn't. When it's translated to parve, which is the Latin word for little, and it becomes parve Genesis, it's a pure calque. So it's completely just taken. You just translate the sense, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything unless you know what that word parve Genesis means, and that it refers to leptogenesis, which then refers to this book. But when we have this kind of hybrid, this kind of partial caulking, a partial borrowing, it leaves the information somewhat obscure for the copier or the copyist or the scribe, because if they know what it means, then we shouldn't have a problem, right? They should be able to copy directly and we'll be fine. But if they don't know what it means, then it's more likely that we'll be looking for a meaningful word. And so that's where these things arise, where we end up with words like lacto and lecto. Like, so I mean, there's a manuscript that says the book of the daughters of Adam of lactogenesis, and lactogenesis is like milk. I mean, it's about like, it's like when milk, yeah,
Milk origins.
milk origins, yeah. And lectogenesis, which is reading Genesis. And so I think actually a lot of scribes probably saw something else. But it comes down to this kind of this strange nature of bringing a word from one language to another, where part of it makes sense in the language, in the target language, but part of it doesn't.
In your answer, I started wondering, I don't know that I've ever come across any evidence to the contrary, but I am curious. Is are scribes simply copyists in the sense that you could sit someone down and they're basically just uh like copying a picture, like you're just copying characters? Is that ever the case, or do you have to be familiar with the language to be entrusted with being a scribe?
So we have examples of that historically, that people have been trained to to just copy letters without meaning being important. But that's not the norm, and it's not the norm in medieval Christian circles. These were more likely trained Latin scribes that knew the language, knew what they were doing. So, but it is, I mean, there are examples of scribes that are just copying the letters, but it's not likely the case in this sort of situation.
That seems like a scenario. It's probably wrong, but that seems like a scenario where somebody crossed a picket line. Like those are scribal scabs or something. They're
Yeah,
they're not as
yeah,
good as the skilled laborers. They'll work for
yeah.
cheaper.
Exactly, but also like it happens, or it's more likely to happen if you like have a manuscript in a different script or a different language that just isn't known, but somebody wants a copy of it for other purposes, or that it's included in a manuscript of something else. So like sometimes you might have that kind of thing where you can kind of tell that something has been copied without the full understanding. But I mean, automatically mistakes happen more when a scribe is copying something that's not in a language they're familiar with. I mean, that's just bound to happen.
Yeah, man, that
It
stuff
happened. I
is.
mean, it's just like my German citations. I had to have so many people read through because, like, I mean, I read German fine and I use it for academic purposes, but like, I get stuff wrong. Like, I forget the umlauts, like the little dots above the U or the
Mhm.
whatever, and like people, like, so I have to get that corrected because even though I know what I'm copying, it's sometimes you hit the wrong key and your eyes don't pick it up the same when you're not a native speaker, not like completely ingrained in it.
I mean, the number of typos that I have in an email that
In
I'll write for
English.
work, I would say
Yeah.
even in my first language, I don't
Yep.
always catch things because a lot of times you know what you intend and you
Yep.
read what you intend rather than what you. And hey, man, we don't have to sit here with a piece of parchment and like
Right.
measure out to make sure we have the right space and everything and copy
Exactly.
some old document that we might receive damnation if we do it wrong. So
Exactly.
the stakes are a lot lower for us. Man, this so I I I'm half sorry. Uh, I'm not sorry, but I'm kind of sorry that I camped out so much on the broader issue of text criticism and scribal stuff. It's so interesting. This is actually a friend of mine recently described text critics as like the nerds of nerds in biblical studies. Like,
Well, I'll
um,
take that as a compliment, I guess.
I
That's
think it was. It very much
yeah.
was. It was said with endearment. And I believe it with like a deep and abiding affection that this is really interesting and it's almost like you guys are trying to transport yourselves back over the shoulder of a person centuries or millennia ago, and I think that's really interesting. So, but because I did that, and I usually transition with this question anyway, but I mean it more this time than normally. Is there something in the article that I didn't ask about that you were really hoping I was going to ask about?
Well, I think one of the things that I just thought was most fun about the article was that I did that kind of historical looking over the shoulder, but both to the ancient and medieval scribes, but also to modern scholars, and that's so it was kind of like a history of research piece as well as textual criticism, because what I end up looking at is that we have this thing, the book of the daughters of Adam of leptogenesis, that they get wrong all over the place. But then in the second half of the 1800s, there's this manuscript that's discovered, a Syriac manuscript that has a list of the names of the wives of the patriarchs. So the women who were married to all the men in the Bible, or married, I mean, it's they, the mothers of the patriarchs from Adam through Abraham, which aren't named. So all these women are, they're just like, and Seth had caused children to be born, and they then, he lived that long, and then he died, and then Enosh, and then it goes on generation after generation, but the women aren't named. And the Book of Jubilees gives names to these women. And so in this document found in it's actually like from around 800, I think, the Syriac manuscript, but it has the names of these women, and it's called The Names of the Wives of the Patriarchs from the Hebrew Book of Jubilees. And so when that was published in the 1860s, um, suddenly we get this transition from people saying, "Oh, the Galatian decree, we don't understand what's going on. It's talking about leptogenesis, and that's jubilees, but we don't know much else." Till to that people are saying, "Hey, that's probably a reference to this list of the names of the wives of the patriarchs." Because it says daughters in the Galatian decree and it says wives in the that other document, and those are both women. So thus we must be talking about the same thing or something similar. So Robert Charles proposed that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then basically everybody else just repeats Charles. They say this throughout the 19th or throughout the 20th century, even after the Dead Sea Scrolls are found. All this writing about the Book of Jubilees, everybody just keeps saying, "Hey, there's also a title, the Book of the Daughters of Adam, that was given to Jubilees, but that's probably has to do with this thing about the wives, but we don't really know." Or no, they don't say we don't really know. They say it probably has to do with the wives, um, and yet there is no evidence that the wives and the daughters are the same thing, right? I mean, we have nowhere that this is called the Book of the Daughters of Adam. It's called the Wives of the Patriarchs according to Jubilees. And so what I'm asking is, why does this happen? And again, I think it's that same filling in the blanks that happens with scribes in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, that happens with the modern scholars, is that they have these couple of reference points and they say, "Ah, that's it," and I'm throwing it in there. This is what I have. This is what I know, and we'll run with that. And so I kind of go through this and say, well, actually, nobody ever makes an argument other than Robert Charles saying, "Hey, that might be something," and then everybody else says, kind of repeats that, and I say, well, we don't actually know. We don't know that. We don't know that this is a reference to the names of the wives of the patriarchs. We don't know that there was ever an extracted version of Jubilees that focused on the daughters of Adam. We don't have this anywhere. And so, like, to repeat that claim again and again actually isn't helpful to scholarship, because we don't know.
Is the uncertainty more of a problem if it seems like a minor issue? Because it seems like this is not a big deal. I want to move on. I don't want to have to camp out here.
Yeah.
And so that uncertainty is like it's well, the stakes aren't that high. It's probably this, let's move on to bigger and better things.
Definitely, it's the lower the stakes, the easier it is for people to accept uncertainty or to make claims in their uncertainty, without backing them up. Like, I think but I mean, I think scholarship should acknowledge uncertainty. I think it's a huge problem if we don't have all the evidence we need to make a claim and we're making it. I think we can put things forth as hypotheses and discuss things, but I think it should be very clear in those discussions what we're lacking of evidence, and or how our arguments are actually built. And that's where, I mean, I guess the more you have invested in the truth claim that you're making, the more the more you might get, led into a discussion where you'll make bold claims without being able to back them up or whatever. But I think in general in scholarship, it's more of a problem than it should be, because I think people should just learn to spend more time saying, here is the things that it can't be, here are the problems we do have, and as for the conclusion of what it actually is or what it actually was, we're still uncertain.
I kind of blame outsiders as an outsider. um, I think I think Stargate and Ancient Aliens have maybe put in our heads that like we want big answers.
Yeah.
from big brains, and uncertainty is, I don't, it's a sign of dithering, or like you're not
Yeah.
productive. And I don't know. I hope maybe
Yeah.
that not just this interview, although yes, this interview, but this podcast overall is like, no, man, these cracks between things that don't seem that important are going to reveal a lot of stuff to us, those of
Yeah.
us who are non-specialists. And so I appreciate you at least entertaining my curiosity on
Oh,
the
yeah.
arcane, minute facets.
Yeah, of course. And I think it's like, it's a really, I mean, I guess actually it's a really good point that you bring up, because I would say we can know a lot of things about a lot of things. But what I know about and what I can say with more certainty isn't the answer to the question people might be asking, and especially from the outside. Like, so if somebody wants to know, what was that thing? I can say, well, I don't know, but I can tell you something about what scribes thought it was, or what their lack of knowledge shows us about scribal culture, or what the modern historic or the modern research on the Book of Jubilees has done to this thing. So I know a lot of things, and I can say a lot of things with certainty, but I can't necessarily say with certainty what exactly this referred to, like this passage in the Galatian decree, what it was intended to refer to. I can't I can't answer that 100%. And so that's two different things, right? And so maybe as scholars we're not good enough at explaining what we do know when we need to say that we don't know something.
Are there, I think that's a helpful transition for this question. Are there books, blogs, podcasts, YouTube channels, are just, websites, museums or something that would help point people in the right direction on these bigger things that you deal with, to just get a glimpse of what's going on in your world?
Well, I mean, I do a little bit of YouTubing on my channel. I'm Bible Monger on YouTube, and my thing is the Bible was written backwards, and so I look at the kind of reception history, bigger questions of how's the Bible, why does the Bible have so many different ancient sources in it, like old ancient Near Eastern things that show up in the Bible, things like that. And my goal is to keep moving all the way into these medieval texts that rewrite the Bible and talk about things like that, and talk about all kinds of different issues. So that's just to throw that out there. But the I think this is a real challenge we have in the field, is that some of these discussions are so technical, we get so bound up in our minutia that it's not out there in layman terms. It's not out there in ways that make it accessible and make it understandable why we're doing these things, what the discussions are actually about. And so I think that's definitely an area we have to develop in the future.
Well, for sure, we'll be checking out that YouTube channel. I noticed the hoodie. I was going to ask about that, so you
Yeah, yeah,
saved me
that's
having
right.
a. I like
Yep.
that. What do you read for fun?
What do I read for fun? Well, I tend to read more for work than for fun. I've been rereading Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time recently.
For work?
It's no, that's the fun. But so I started reading that because I read through as a teenager and never got to the end, actually, or started as a teenager and then
Neither did he,
just kept.
though. To
No,
be
neither did
fair,
he, to be fair. But I lost it at some point, so I decided I wanted to get through it. So I don't know, through like the 10th book or something at this point. And then I mean I like the occasional Grisham novel and stuff like that to get me through a long plane ride, stuff like that. And then just I don't know, I like ancient literature, so I like to read. I like to read the old stuff, Gilgamesh, and the ancient myths of Mesopotamia, of Egypt, of Greece. I love these recent retellings, rewritings of Greek mythology. So, like Stephen Fry has a couple of volumes of that's his name, yeah,
yeah.
with these rewritten, told, repenned myths and that kind of stuff. I really enjoy.
Like I think it's Madeline Miller. Uh,
Yes, yes,
Circe and Song of Achilles. I haven't
yep,
finished Song of Achilles yet, but I really
yep,
liked
yep.
Circe. It was really good.
Yep, yeah, me too. And I have Song of Achilles. I'm reading now. Actually, I have it on my bookshelf. So it's yeah,
She's
it's
pretty
that
good.
very good. And it's so for me, it's just a lot of fun to to see that we're allowed to do that, play with the texts in a new way. So we're giving them new life, and that people are engaging and making bringing the language out of the the dark ages and giving us something that's actually readable and exciting. And yeah, it's really good stuff.
I think Grendel and Wicked too. I understand Wicked is a much more like it's rewriting something much more recent, but this idea
Yeah,
that you get to see a different perspective from a story that you already know,
yeah.
it adds, I think, depth even to the original story.
Yeah, yeah, and
See,
and that's exactly what I'm interested in when it comes to the Bible as well. To be honest, like that's what I'm interested in, is the rewritings, retellings that are popular throughout history, and so it's a really interesting genre that just keeps on giving.
I I wish I wish that we had more versions of what we're describing with, Madeline Miller, Stephen Fry, things like that with biblical characters. And maybe there are, and I just don't know about them.
Well, throughout antiquity there are, and so maybe that's a discussion we'll have to have another time.
Absolutely, because you're welcome back
Yeah,
anytime.
yeah. Thanks.
Matthew Monger, thank you so much for being here. This was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. It's great.
Thanks so much for listening. Before you go, here is a preview of next week's episode, my conversation with Shalom Holtz. We'll be discussing land possession in Isaiah 60, verse 21. Take care.
The immediate context for Isaiah 60 is this is the legal reality with which they live, right? This is how the world in which they see it. How this, whether or not this contrasts, dovetails, echoes anything that they are familiar with from Israelite tradition is really hard to judge based on the chapter, right? I think some of it, um, we could bring in the discussion of, let's say, Leviticus 25, right, where you have the Jubilee laws, which are designed to prevent the kind of they're designed to kind of maintain family relationships to land over the long term, and to undo the effects that might have come because someone had to sell his property to uh, to cover debts or whatever. And then the Jubilee Law's vision, at least, is that there's kind of a giant reset every 50 years. Right? That might be something that kind of falls into here. Now, whether or not the audience in Isaiah 60 is or even Isaiah 60 is aware of it is a bigger question that I think we can get into here. But you might want to bring that in here.